entered the room. Evan Glass, running for County Council at Large. Marilyn Balcom, running for County Council at Large. Former chair of the Democratic Party and candidate for Lieutenant Governor, Susie Turnbull, my friend. Thank you all for having me here today. I really appreciate it. My name is Jeff Waldstreicher, and it's been my honor to serve in the Maryland House of Delegates on your behalf. I grew up right here in Montgomery County. I went to our public schools. I'm raising my 3 children here, my wife and I. The older 2 go to our public schools. The younger one's coming up. He'll be in kindergarten next year. We love this community, and we love the values that we represent. No one's fought for those values more for the last 12 years than Rich Madaleno, who's in the back, our current state senator. Rich is running for governor, as you know, and I'm excited to be running for Rich's seat. We have an incredible tradition of political progressive leadership here in District 18, both at the state level and at the federal level. Chris Van Hollen, Sharon Grossfeld, Jamie Raskin. Their values are my values. Their fight is now our fight. You know, we live in the age of resistance, but I know, and I know you know, that resistance didn't start in January of 2017. We've been in the trenches together. When our state said our gay and lesbian neighbors couldn't marry, we passed marriage equality here in Maryland. When our state said our immigrant neighbors couldn't get driver's license or go to public colleges, we passed the Maryland Dream Act. When our state said it was okay to walk around with Uzis and AR-15s, we passed the strictest gun law in the entire union. Ladies and gentlemen, the resistance is winning. And then Trump won. Vladimir Putin got him elected. And we marched. And we marched in the Women's March, and the Climate March, and the March for Science. And in Annapolis, we got back to work. We funded Planned Parenthood at 100%. We funded our infrastructure, billions and billions of dollars for roads and transit and schools. And we passed mandatory paid sick leave in Maryland. In the House this year, and in the Senate next year, there is more work to be done. The resistance continues unabated. Working with each of you, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pass the Fight for 15 minimum wage increase. We're going to pass free community college. We're going to pass universal voter registration, and we will finally, here in Maryland, pass universal single-payer health care. My name is Jeff Waldstreicher. I want to work with you, fight with you in the Maryland State Senate. Thank you again for having me.
Well, I'd just like to start, first off, by asking, who's not running for office here? Okay, because we are starting a new hashtag. It's called Not Me, for everybody who's not running for office. Because if you go to these events, you see what an amazing outpouring of civic involvement there has been, of people coming to these events and people willing to step forward and do the work and take the time and put themselves out there walking the streets and knocking on your doors and begging you for money, which I've had to do sometimes, and it's not that exciting to do. It really isn't. And yet, we have a crowd of people here who are just amazing. We have 2 people running for Senate on bookending our group for 1 seat. We have 8 people running for 3 delegates, and thank God, because if I had to pick one person out of these 8, I think I'd just go home and, put my head in the oven and say, I can't do it. But you get to pick 3 of them. And the great thing is, I think it's hard to find one of these people that we would say would not just be a superb candidate there. So I'm not going to take any picks here, but I'm just going to say thank you for this great group. And one of the things we can tell they're great is, I have a little piece here written down where I was supposed to say, we want everybody to address what's been happening since that day, in 2015, where that particular person rode down the elevator in Trump Towers and started putting us on this roller coaster. But I think all of you have, just about all of you have already told us that trying to deal with these events and the degradation they've put in our lives over the last couple of years has been a major factor in why you're running. So if you have not sufficiently addressed it in your opening remarks, you may find time during the questions or bring it up in the closing, but that is something that I think all of us have looked to, is what can we do, what can our candidates do to bring us back into some sort of normal kind of political situation. So, in terms of our questions here, we had about 40 or 50. We could have probably gone about 6 hours. So we worked really hard. We've winnowed it down to about 20. We can't possibly ask everybody to address all the questions. So we have looked at their websites and we've used some of that research, and I urge all of you to go to their websites. They're typically amazing amounts of information and thoughts that have gone into there. So I would go to their sites, but we did some of that. We tried to pick out some questions that would play to their strengths, or maybe if they don't have a strength, maybe a few of them may show something, but I think almost everybody has addressed most of these issues. But we've picked the people, and if your candidate doesn't get asked the question you'd like to hear, that's why if you stick around after we get done the formal part of the program, you can ask any one of these questions to any of the candidates, and we hope to some extent it opens up things you should be thinking about when you're trying to make that choice. And thank God we still got about 4 months to research all these people and figure out. So we're going to start with transportation, and this first question is going to go to Jared and to Joel. So my 2 J's here. Not Jeff. We'll get to you later. Everybody just about on their website says we're all supporting all these alternatives to roads and more cars. So let's start with Metro. How many of you support a dedicated funding source for Metro? Show of hands first. Everybody? Okay. How many of you have that as a specific point on your website? Good. Okay, so the rest of you may want to think about that. Now that we get to it, Jared and Joel, you certainly both mentioned that on your site. What do you mean by that, and how do you plan to get there? Let's start with Jared first, and then Joel.
Great. And we've got 2 minutes, right, for answers?
2 minutes, and 2 minutes for each answer.
Perfect.
There's a switch.
I'm pretty loud. I can
All right.
use my classroom voice if... Oh, all right. Okay, all right. So that's a great question. I mean, I think there's a variety of ways, and I will say I'm excited to see Delegate Corman in Bethesda, really putting proposals forward from our transit, our current transit fund. I also think just beyond the dedicated funding for Metro, we need to think of a lot of other ways. So one of the things that I would like to look into is whether we can provide a commuter tax credit as an incentive, again, to get people out of their cars, to promote the use of transit. That dedicated funding is great, but I also think Metro is really expensive, especially for folks who are commuting really long distances. Some cases over an hour. I mean, between parking and taking the Metro, it can cost upwards of $15 a day, which is a fortune for some folks. So, can we think about creative ways to bring down the cost of Metro while also funding the infrastructure? And I also think we need to think about creative ways to work with businesses to sort of bridge that last mile gap that some of you may be familiar with, where it's, you may be able to take the MARC train to, to a part of the state, but you can't get from the train station to your office park or your job somewhere. So can we work, these sort of micro transit systems that, Metro is starting to utilize a little bit with these smaller buses, but can we work with businesses to create sort of shuttle bus systems, again, to be able to, you should be able to get from anywhere in the state to any other point if you don't want to use your car. And I think, we've got some great examples and some great ideas in the works, and I'm excited to tackle that if I get to Annapolis.
Great. Thanks. Yes, no? Good. All right, thanks. Thanks, Karen. Transportation is a quality of life issue. First and foremost, it's about quality of life, getting commuters from one place to another efficiently and in a sustainable manner. Now, currently, we probably realize that's not happening. I've taken Metro for nearly 2 decades throughout my career in Washington in the area, and I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that it has gotten progressively worse year by year, and now we see that it's in a situation of dire neglect. Well, we have to think more holistically about transportation. We have to be encouraging bike riding. We have to be encouraging walking. We have to be encouraging other modes of mass transit. And I'll say as well, clearly, that there's the purple line that's coming in. That's an east-west issue. What about north-south? It's not just about widening highways. It's not going to reduce the kinds of pressures that we have on our network. We have to look at telecommuting. So we have to be very creative. We have to make sure that we're doing it in a holistic way. Now, the problem right now is that Governor Hogan has essentially botched many of these projects. He botched the rollout of the Purple Line. The Purple Line has created havoc amongst many of the bordering communities. Go to Libbinsville, go to my town, Chevy Chase. People who support the Purple Line are very disappointed in how that's been rolled out. That's part A. Part B is he's rolled out a very expensive transportation plan that we don't know how it's going to be paid for, and it came out of left field. It's not part of an integrated strategy. So in Annapolis, at the State House, we're going to have to figure out how to manage not only the governor and his or her expenditures, but we're also going to have to figure out how to work with the federal delegation, how to work with Senator Van Hollen in particular, who's an appropriator, and engage him on these kinds of hard funding issues and be sensitive to the local communities. As a town councilman in Chevy Chase, I understand what it means for residents, for my constituents, to feel frustrated and aggravated by not having a transportation system that works for them. So we need to make sure that we're working with everybody to get this right.
Okay, and going forward, we're going to have a bunch of fairly specific questions, so don't jump ahead of your question. Well, the next question is about the Purple Line, so try to stick just to the Purple Line, and somebody else will get those other questions, and you'll have to answer everything else later on. So this is going to be for Al and Emily. On the Purple Line, we have 3 questions that you can address. Did you have any concerns about it before it was approved? Have they been resolved in the current build-out? What should the state be doing to assist those affected by construction, as Joel brings up? And what can the state do to help to make the project more viable and help it live up to its projections, so it's not kind of like the Inter-County Connector, which was a bit of a bust for a while. So, Emily first and then Al.
Hello? Okay. So I've been a supporter of the Purple Line for many years. When I ran in 2014, it was one of my #1 issues that I would hear at the doors when I was talking to voters. People want more public transportation options, and the east-west route is something that a lot of people want to be able to get from Bethesda to Silver Spring and vice versa, and even further points. I have been concerned with the rollout of the Purple Line. I think that giving communities 2 days notice that they're going to close an entire trail that people are using when this project has been in the works for years was wholly insufficient. And as a result, a lot of people who live in those communities and who use the trails have been really deeply offended by how little regard has been paid to them. I think it's an incredibly important role of an elected official to be in the know and communicating to their communities how big projects are impacting and what the rollout is going to be, and to be a voice for two-way communication. So we have an area of our district, Libbinsville, that is really concerned right now about having 2 of the main ways to get into the community shut down simultaneously. We need to make sure that our elected officials are bringing State Highway Administration and the Montgomery County Department of Transportation together to talk about how are we going to solve this, can we resolve the timeline issues so that we can make sure that the legitimate concerns of seniors there, that they may not have access to their community in the event of an evacuation or a healthcare issue. These are really serious concerns. So if I'm elected, that will be a #1 priority issue across legislative priorities or across issues, is serving as a two-way conduit for information with our state. But for the Purple Line specifically, I think we can see the acute need for that. Did I answer all 3 of the questions?
Close enough.
Okay, thank you very much.
In 2 minutes, I don't guarantee anybody's going to answer all my questions, so.
Thank you. So first I'll just start off by saying that state legislators don't have a big role on transportation projects like the Purple Line. We don't get to decide whether it gets built or whether it doesn't get built. That falls more to the governor. But that being said, I did participate and pay very close to the Purple Line since even before I was in office. And back in maybe it was 2008 when there were alternatives being studied, for the Purple Line. I did participate in that process. I testified on the draft environmental impact statement. I submitted comments to the final environmental impact statement. So I've been watching it very closely. And I mentioned my training is in engineering. So my approach is an analytical approach. For any transportation project, I'm going to scrutinize it very closely. When there's millions or billions of public dollars at play, I'm going to want to look at that very closely. So I'm going to look under the hood and try to figure out what's going on. So I did have concerns about the Purple Line before, and I have concerns about the Purple Line now. The rollout was terribly botched, and I'm hearing from many, many constituents, many of whom are indifferent or even support the Purple Line, who are very, very upset that their child's route to school was disrupted on very short notice and in violation of what was promised, that their commute to work was disrupted. So those are some of the concerns. What should the state do? Well, we need a better system of accountability and enforcement. We seem to have a system where there's finger pointing between the concessionaire, the county, and the state, and no one is held accountable. We need to fix that. What should the state do to make it more viable? I think going forward, we need to do a better job when these projects are in the formative stages, so we have ridership that the state stands behind and is not opaque and hard to defend.
Okay, so the next question is going to go to Jeff and Leslie. Just in general on the topics of improving support for alternatives to cars and increasing public transit, pedestrian access, and so forth. Just in general, are there pending bills in the legislature or something that you would propose to be passed in those general areas? And if so, where are you going to get the funding for it? For whatever you want to propose. Leslie first.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, thank you. Just so I understand, you were saying I missed the very first part of what you said.
The general topic of we're trying to do things, leaving aside the Purple Line and Metro, other kinds of support for public transit, pedestrian access, those kinds of
thank you. So in terms of how to spend money, I think a lot of folks probably know how the priorities that we have. If you look at all of our websites, you will see probably the same types of issues again and again. In terms of how to generate the revenue to fund those projects, that's, I think, my strong suit. So in terms of alternate modes of transportation, there's a lot of things that we can do to both invest in green technologies for our transit systems, and then also just looking in general to, to essentially looking to raise revenues to fund those types of things. So for example, some of the things that I would propose, we have to move away from cars. I do not support widening roads because we're just going to have an influx. We know we have an influx of people coming into our schools. We're going to have an influx as we grow our businesses to having more individuals living with us in our towns and our communities. So you create super highways like you have in California. At some point that's not going to be enough either. So that's not a good direction for us to go in. We have to look at both carrot and stick approaches. So for this, I would say incentives would work very well. So we should incentivize. I think my proposal is a little bit similar to what Jared was saying in terms of incentivizing telework. And by doing that, by working with small businesses and others, we could have a tax credit where we could have less people on the road. We need to look the world over to understand the best green technologies that exist. In Europe right now, there are alternatives to our bad commute on Connecticut Ave, where there's a small sign that says now it's four lanes, now it's 2 lanes. There's better ways to do that, where you have technology in the roadway. So there's investments. We know that when the Amazon deal is being talked about, that there is an infrastructure investment that people are talking about that the governor is proposing. We do need an infrastructure investment. And not necessarily his proposal, but we need to invest in greener technologies that provide the behaviors and the outcomes that we're looking for.
Well, I'll come over here to prevent the feedback. It's not often that I support new roads. But when we do build new roads, we need to build whole roads. And what that means is building bike lanes, separated bike lanes, as part of any new roads we build, as well as offset sidewalks for pedestrians. So everyone has access to the new transportation facilities. We build cars, bicyclists, pedestrians. But it's impossible, just impossible to take Metro out of this equation. Make no mistake, fixing and funding Metro is the most important transportation priority of our time. There are two bills in front of us in Annapolis right now. One, to fully fund our obligation, Maryland's obligation, for Metro and dedicate that funding. And the second is just as important, to reform the Metro Board so that it is accountable, transparent, and smaller so we can fix the Metro system together. When we talk about transportation, let's not forget to talk about the small stuff. You know, my office has often prided itself on being responsive and accountable to you when it comes to constituent service. And the reason I focus so much on filling potholes and all the small stuff when it comes to our transportation system is because when government doesn't do the little things right, no one trusts government to do the big things right. And that's why I always give out my cell phone, my office number, on these small transportation issues that affect your daily life. That's what I'm here for as well.
Okay. Okay, so this is a show of hands question to everyone. First, Governor Hogan has proposed to use private money to build 4 new toll lanes on I-495 and I-270 to help relieve the gridlock. First, how many, and it's obviously in the infancy, but how many of you are generally in favor of that proposal? Okay. How many of you are adamantly opposed? And how many of you, if any of you, have an idea that there's something to that, but you'd propose something, you want to work on it, you want to think about it? Is there anyone who's like interested in that proposal? Okay. All right, well, we'll move on from that one, since that one seems to be fairly unique there. Let me ask this. Some people have suggested that instead we should have reversible lanes. Is that a suggestion most people think works? Reversible lanes on there? Do most people think that works? Yes? It depends. Well, I think y'all probably need to be thinking about that one because I expect that's one that's going to continue to come up, and I think it's obviously there's a huge gridlock on 495 and 270, and we'll have, in another forum, we'll have time to explore what some of the other options may be for that. But we're going to move on from transportation to healthcare. And this one's going to go to Emily and Dana. So everybody, I think, on their website pretty much universally said they're in favor of better ensuring healthcare access. For this party, anyway, that's pretty much of a no-brainer. But how are we going to get there in the face of the relentless attacks on the Affordable Care Act that have been going on, both directly by trying to repeal it or by the undermining efforts that have been going on ever since repeal failed? What can Maryland do to fill in the gaps that are being opened up in the Affordable Care Act? So we'll start with Dana and then go to Emily.
Oh, it's on. I got it. So there are a number of things that we can do. There are a number of issues that are currently under consideration. The most important critical issue that the federal government has done to us is it's gutted the individual mandate on the federal level. We can replace that with a state mandate to be able to fund the coverage for people who will no longer be able to afford to pay the 50% increase in their premiums. There are a number of other things that can be done. I've been speaking with some of my advisors who work on federal health care and have done so for the last 40 to 50 years. And they made the point that there are ways, since funding some of these ACA programs, particularly the Silver program, which is the one up from the basic program, there is a requirement that the federal government fully fund that. If the state were to add a premium to those programs, the federal government would have to, by statute, send us more money, which we could then use to help those who aren't covered by other policies. This gets very complicated, it's in the weeds. We could conceivably expand Medicaid It's Medicaid, not Medicare, creating a Medicaid for all where anybody can choose to opt in, sort of a public option. That's not as viable for the state because it doesn't come with as much money. Finally, there's the issue that I think the majority of people here would love to see, and that's federal Medicare for all, national improved single-payer health care. I've been working with PNHP for decades on this issue. When I first trained back in the 70s, my first attending, Bud Relman, was one of those conservatives who said, I want to get government out of medicine, 10 years after Medicare came in. 20 years later, when he retired and became the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, he came out and said, medicine is an art. It is a healing profession. It is not a business. We need single payer for all. We must start the education here in the state so people understand that that is the only viable alternative.
Thank you so much for the question. I love talking about healthcare, in part because this is one of my absolute areas of expertise. I've worked for a decade in the health policy space on the federal level, and I've also worked with our advocates here at the state level to try and better our healthcare system here in Maryland. So I'm really excited to get this question to talk a bit about some of the options we have here in Maryland. Dr. Beyer gave a lot of really great examples of some of the ways that we can improve our system here to respond to the federal attacks that we've had. And so I'm just going to share a little bit about my view and a little bit of context as well. So Maryland is a little bit different than any other state that has attempted single payer, and because we have a waiver from CMS that allows us to do an all-payer demo here. So we already have a rate-setting commission here in Maryland that is setting the reimbursement rates for hospital procedures. And that is going to be expanded in phase 2 of this to include outpatient. We are closer here in Maryland to being able to implement single payer than any other state that has attempted and failed. So, and we've gotten a lot of coverage in national publications for our opportunities here as well. The Healthy Maryland Act is a bill that either this week or next is going to be introduced. It's something that I would be strongly supportive of. It would set up a single payer system here in Maryland. And it's something that I would love to work on if elected. As Dr. Beyer noted, a public option that allows for purchasing Medicaid plan is another good way to respond to some of these attacks that we've had on our healthcare system here in Maryland. And in part, why that is so attractive is that Medicaid can negotiate drug prices. And so our Medicaid system can actually say to a drug manufacturer, this is what we're going to pay for this drug, this is what's included in our formulary, and having more people enrolled in the program will allow the Medicaid program to have an even more robust formulary. So I'm excited to work on this if elected and look forward to more questions.
And the next question is going to go to Mila and Ron, and it was sort of actually asking about single payer, and since we've already gotten into this, why don't I just combine those two questions? What can we do, ask you two to also address, what can Maryland do to address the gaps that are being opened up in the Affordable Care Act, and what's your view about single payer? Should we move there, and if we are, what are the obstacles in the way that we would have to overcome? So I'll give you your own 2 minutes on health care. Mila first.
Okay, what was the first one again? I'm sorry.
Talk about healthcare.
Healthcare, okay. Well, I agree with everything Emily said. The fact that we have an all-payer system makes Maryland very unique. We're already pretty far down towards creating a single-payer system. I 100% support that. I think healthcare is a human right, and that should be one of the basic responsibilities of government, is to provide access to healthcare for everyone. As for the problems getting to that, a lot of them are bureaucratic. We only get so much reimbursement from the federal level for state programs and things like that. I think we really need to work on getting the individual mandate in Maryland, as Dr. Beyer was talking about. I know they're working on a bill that would help do that here and create an insurance program that you could pay into with your tax penalty from the federal government to put towards buying health insurance in Maryland. And that is a very good and intriguing way to address that problem, I think.
All right.
If we don't trip some of the candidates, and we'll reduce our candidate pool a little bit by killing them on stage here by the time we get done.
Can we just get voted off? Like, do we have to get killed? I think we're all pretty much in agreement that, you know, single payer would be the best way to go. In lieu of that, though, until we get there, I think one of the things we can do to help bring down costs is, one, get the pool as large as possible, and two, create programs within the system that incentivize preventative care. A lot of what happens now is reactionary, and what we need to do is move towards. It's more cost effective to fix things in the beginning than it is in the end, as we all well know. So that would be a couple ways we could help to address it. Finally, I think, what was the last part you said?
We had the single payer, the Affordable Care Act, some of these things, you know, whatever. I'm going to leave this list open. Tell us about your thoughts on care generally.
So in general, I mean, we all want to focus on, we definitely want to focus on the issues I spoke about before, and then keep in mind the goal of it, which is to prolong life and prolong the quality of life. And I think we can, as long as we keep the focus there, I think we're doing a good job. In terms of state programs that do that, I think what the legislature has done so far has been really helpful in terms of stemming the effects of the rollbacks, but until we get better help federally, I mean, we're kind of handed in that, so, but thank you.
Okay. And the next one's going to go to Helga and Al, so if you can pass